Ivy Clark was the last to enter the grand hall of the Mansion Thorn. Nobody the eye expected, nobody the greeted, crossed the tall doors with the head held high, but there was no in. She had no trace of arrogance, only a trained calm. Her dress was a simple, slightly wrinkled grey linen. The faded cardigan fell over her shoulders as if she didn't care about the cold, neither he trial. He walked slowly, like someone who has nothing hurry but no destiny. Seeing her, a murmur ran through the room. A man in a tie, golden, he burst out laughing. "Is it the employee?" he asked with sarcasm, while a young woman with designer dress, he whispered between laughs. It must be some ex looking for attention. Some, they raised their phones. Flash, photo, instant meme. He hadn't even sat down, but Ivy didn't answer. She didn't come down. The look. He just adjusted the strap of the cloth bag that he carried hanging from his shoulder, as if that gesture had a secret meaning. He stood in the background without asking permission, neither apologized for existing. From there, I watched, not with anger, but with brutal lucidity. Every fake smile, every disdainful glance, every malicious whisper was recorded as if in an archive invisible. The room was shining with marble, chandeliers and champagne glasses, but underneath of the brightness hid a truth raw, contempt disguised as courtesy. And no one, absolutely no one, imagined that that silent woman not only had a right to be there, was the owner of that whole place, Logan Thorne's legitimate wife, the sole heir, and the mind behind the proof that he was about to tear apart all his masks. If this revelation touched you, stay one more moment. Continue reading. The lawyer. He cleared his throat at the front of the room, a discreet gesture to demand attention, although in reality, everyone already were attentive, but not to him. The glances continued fixed in Ivy, as if her presence was out of place. With the antique candlesticks and the scent of imported roses, the lawyer opened the sealed envelope and silence fell suddenly. In seconds, the solemnity was imposed, and the faces that once mocked now, they were eagerly awaiting the figures, names, the awards, because that was, after all, what they were hoping for, to be rewarded. Children, nephews, elders, partners, everyone thought they deserved it. No one imagined what was to come. I, Logan Thorne, being of sound mind, he began. The reading, and as the words, they advanced, the faces changed, because Logan hadn't divided his fortune. He hadn't listed heirs, multiple neither left percentages for each one. All, the actions, the properties, the accounts banking, the investments, the mansion same, remained in the hands of one person, Ivy Clark, his wife. The room exploded. "What kind of joke is this?" he shouted, a cousin who had flown in from London. "This is illegal," a woman screamed, with pearl necklace. Others, they demanded evidence, doubted his sanity, accused the lawyer of fraud. But Ivy already had everything ready. He opened her cloth bag and, without a word, she placed the evidence on the table. The marriage certificate, private photos, letters with the calligraphy unmistakable Logan, and a video recorded his wedding day. The images left no room for doubt, and even so, they resisted. They couldn't see her as an equal. They couldn't accept that this woman who did not have illustrious surname nor jewelry visible was now the owner of the world they coveted. Have you ever felt like your worth was underestimated? Tell me about it in the comments. Was so when the side door of the living room opened with a chirp, almost imperceptible, but enough to stop chaos. Everyone turned around, expecting to see someone else, lawyer, maybe a notary, perhaps a member of the staff. Nobody. I was expecting to see Logan Thorne, alive, upright, serene, with the grey hair combed back and the same sharp look that there was built empires. For an eternal moment, no one spoke, not even Ivy. Logan's lips curved slightly, in that way that only she recognized as complicity. And then he walked to the center of the room, as if returning from the dead, because in a way, it toward. "Thank you all for showing your true face," he finally said, his voice firm, words They fell like stones onto a frozen lake. The guests looked at each other, bewildered, as if the script they had memorized was no longer of any use. Logan explained it essential. There was no dead. It had all been a setup in scene, an experiment devised by him and executed by Ivy to reveal the truth hidden behind the smiles and the family ties. They wanted to know who were in absence of power, when money it seemed having disappeared, when the masks were not necessary. Ivy had supported ridicule, mockery, contempt, not as a victim, but as an architect. And now, in front of everyone, her silence became more eloquent than any speech. Some they tried to recompose oneself. One of the nephews approached. He quickly approached Ivy with a glass of wine, feigning a cordial smile. "I didn't know it was you," he murmured, as if that would erase his cruel laughter from minutes before. Another asked apologies in a low voice, pleading confusion, stress, shock, but it was too late. The hidden cameras, audio logs, messages sent in half of contempt. Everything had been carefully documented. Logan didn't need evidence judicial. What I was looking for was clarity. Who was willing to trample another for ambition? Who dared to humiliate a woman for her clothes, for their silence, for not fitting in your world of appearances? One by one, they went being pointed out, calmly, firmly. Logan didn't scream, nor did he take revenge. He only communicated, with documents in hand, his decision irrevocable. Those names would be removed not only from the will, but from their circle, from their life. They would be suspended, the accesses, the accounts, the memberships. The doors that were once opened by carrying your surname would be closed forever. Some they begged, others were outraged, even more, as if the punishment were unjust. But it is true that everyone had had his opportunity, and they had wasted on mockery, in arrogance, in demonstrating that without Logan's money were so small as the gestures that they betrayed. Ivy didn't speak much during the process. He just looked, and that look, calm, steady, unfathomable, was enough to make you feel more uncomfortable than any reproach. His role was accomplished. I didn't need to justify anything. I had planned every detail with Logan, knowing that the most valuable inheritance was not the money, but the true. Because the money can to be bought, to be lost, to be multiplied. But the dignity, once torn, is not so easily mended. And that dignity was what Ivy stood for when chose to enter that room as someone who had nothing, to reveal who they really were, those who said have it all. In a corner of the living room, a woman elderly observed in silence. There was no laughed, neither whispered when Ivy arrived. It was the only one who stood up to offer him a chair before it started the reading. Later, Ivy. He searched. "Thank you," he said the woman. He smiled and replied with simplicity, "I didn't do anything, but yes, there was done. I had kept respect in half of the mockery." He had remembered that the humanity is not measured in suits or surnames, but in small gestures when no one is looking. Next to her, two more people. A young assistant from the firm and a niece distant that did not open the mouth throughout the evening, were the only ones who did not fall in the trap. Not because knew the true, but because they didn't know how to behave with decency. The rest dropped out the mansion. Between whispers, veiled threats and looks of bewilderment, some they tried do calls from the lobby, as if a lawyer could revert the public shame they had just experienced. Others left silent, heads bowed, carrying more than their designer coats. They carried the weight of having shown his true soul in front of the only audience that mattered. The news was not long in coming in leak. Within hours, the tabloids speculated newscasts. They talked about the Logan Thorne's big farce. And social media was divided between those who celebrated the fall of the arrogant heirs and those who, they asked, who is Ivy Clark? And that was the right question. Because until then, Ivy had lived in the shadow of a powerful man, protected but also invisible. Her love with Logan wasn't a fairy tale, but a construction daily, of shared silences, of decisions difficult. They had been acquaintances years ago at a municipal library where Ivy worked as an archivist. He didn't wear suits or surnames then, just a notebook, an intense look and questions that no one else asks did. It was a story that few they met. They loved each other, away from the cameras, away from the spotlights. Ivy never wanted fame, and that's why nobody in that room, nor not even the closest ones, I knew that she existed. It was a decision mutual, a protection, a choice that day, it became his greatest strength. After the scandal, Ivy did not give interviews. She did not publish any statements or look for clean his image. He had nothing to clean. The only thing he accepted, it was a private talk with the employees of the foundation, Thorn, who, confused but loyal, wanted to know what would happen with their work, with the projects, with the vision that Logan had left behind. Ivy them, I'm listening with attention, and responded with the clarity of whom always knew where was. Nothing changes for you. On the contrary, now we'll have a dress. No said with arrogance, but with that serenity that comes from having waited for your moment without stepping on anyone's toes. A few minutes, the tension dissolved. He clapped, and the team, one by one, stood up to show him he respect that the surname was not required, but character was inspired. Logan, for his part, disappeared again from the public sphere. He returned to the books, to Your Cabin by the Lake, to life without headlines. It left him the rest to Ivy, not as a resignation, but as an act of absolute trust. He there was tried your world and no longer needed. She, on the other hand, had something else to manage. She had a truth to take care of, not because you should owe something to those who judged, but because he knew that power, without consciousness, it's just a repetition of the damage. Ivy didn't want to repeat anything. She didn't come from a wealthy family, but she did come from a mother who taught to look at the eyes before the surnames, and that legacy, invisible, intangible, was the only one that was truly important to preserve. Days afterwards, Ivy walked alone through the gardens of the mansion Thorn. The same place where she had been looked down upon now seemed wider, more breathable. The air no longer weighed as much as before, the marble statues, the trails impeccable, even the rose bushes cared for with obsession. Everything seemed different, as if at last could inhabit that space without costume. He stopped in front of the bench where he used to feel with Logan at sunset, when still it was just them two, without surnames in game, closed the eyes and for the first time in a lot time was allowed smile without bitterness. Not for having won, but for having resisted without break. A member of the staff approached cautiously, fearing interrupt something sacred. It was one of the gardeners, a man elderly with weathered hands and an honest look. He offered her a freshly picked flower. My mother used to say that violets last until the cruelest winter, said Ivy, accepted with gratitude, not because out custom, but because he understood the gesture. She also had been like that flower, silent, ignored, but resilient. She never sought shine, just stay standing, and in the end, that was what the distinguished from the others. Not the clothes, not the surname, not fortune. His ability to not fall apart when everyone expected it to collapse. In the days following this, Ivy began to reorganize the threads of the Empire Thorn, not with the impetus of a conqueror, but with the precision of a restorer. She didn't change everything immediately. She listened, she observed, and only then acted. He had learned that the true power doesn't shout, it calibrates. It called meetings small, looked at the eyes on each manager and asked a simple question. What would you do if this out yours? Some got tangled up in technical terms. Others, they talked about profits. But a few, they spoke of purpose. Those were the ones Ivy chose to stay with, not because we're perfect, but because they didn't need masks to speak with sincerity. Meanwhile, the media, they insisted. They wanted to know why it there was made, how it had planned, what was looking for with all that. But Ivy remained silent, same as he did in that room. It, toward now facing the world. Let them facts will speak. The video of the reading of the will, leaked by one of those present, already accumulated millions of views. It became a symbol of something bigger, a slap-in-the-face hypocrisy, a claim of the character on the appearance. Without pretending it, Ivy became an icon, but she continued walking with her same firm and silent step, as if all that had nothing to do with she, because in the background, he didn't have. His victory wasn't viral. It was intimate. One day, he received a letter with no sender. The envelope was plain, without stamps, eye-catching, no logos. Inside, a handwritten sheet. He recognized the letter immediately. It was from one of the heirs who had been excluded. He did not ask sorry. I wasn't begging return. I just said, now I understand. Thank you for not responding with hate. I was worse than I imagined. Ivy didn't respond, not out of spite, but because sometimes silence is the only answer that is not forgotten. He kept the letter in a box next to the photos of their wedding, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that even the most arrogant can, someday, see the full mirror. That night, Logan watched from the threshold of the library. He said nothing. He just looked while she closed, carefully removed the lid of the box. He approached and took the hand. Was it worth it, the penalty? He asked. In a low voice, Ivy didn't respond immediately. He looked at her, without drama, without pause. I don't know, but it was necessary. And in that phrase fit everything. The humiliation, the patience, the strategy, the justice. No, they did it out of revenge. They did it because it was time to make it clear that not everything can be done to buy with expensive suits nor surnames ancient. Because the respect is not inherited, it is earned. And there was arrived the time to change the rules. If this story resonates with you, maybe it's time to follow the page. The outside world kept turning with its chaotic rhythm, but in the mansion, Thorn, he time it, seemed to have slowed down. Ivy spent her mornings exploring the hallways with a notebook in hand, noting details that no one else saw. A flickering lamp, a badly hung painting, an employee with the eyes tired. Don't did it not out of obsession, but out of conviction, because he learned that the empires do not sustain themselves in the great speeches, but in the small cares. His way of governing was not to impose, but to get involved, and every gesture, however subtle, was rebuilding a culture of respect that never should have been get lost. One afternoon, while supervised the renovation of one of the reading rooms, a young journalist managed come closer. Just one question, please, he asked. With nervousness, Ivy nodded. What was the hardest part of all this? The woman. He hesitated for a second, but then replied with complete honesty. Not stopping being me, I was the same, even when everyone told me I was worthless. The journalist remained silent, surprised by the frankness. There were no more questions. There was no need. Ivy went back to reviewing some plans, not seeking attention, because she knew that the more powerful words not always need to be amplified. Sometimes it is enough for them to be certain. With he, as the weeks passed, the echoes of the scandal were dissipating, replaced by another fad, another rumor, another public figure in decline. But Ivy remained, not as a celebrity, but as a solid figure, impossible to displace. The foundation, Thorn began funding educational programs for women in vulnerable situations. Scholarships, training workshops, support networks were opened. And although Logan's name followed in the commemorative plaques, everyone knew who was the driving force behind that transformation. Ivy wasn't looking for recognition. I was looking for impact, and I was achieving. Logan, for his part, returned to writing. In one of his essays, published unsigned in an independent magazine, he spoke of the value of the invisible, people who transform the world without need for a stage. It was his way of paying homage to her tribute. Ivy Lowe read one rainy night, sitting in his same armchair where they had so often hugged silent. He said nothing. He just closed the magazine, turned off the lamp, and was allowed cry for the first time since that day in which he crossed the door of the lounge full of mockery. It wasn't sadness, it was relief, because despite everything, I had achieved the most difficult thing, to continue being she-same when the whole world tried to convert it in a shadow. A month afterwards, Ivy hosted a small dinner party at the mansion. It wasn't a gala event or an ostentatious celebration, only a few people, the older employees, the three that do not, they judged that day, and two young beneficiaries of the new scholarships. The food was simple, homemade, served equally to everyone. Ivy sat down in the end of the table, not as a distant hostess, but as part of the group. They laughed, shared stories, toasted new ones' beginnings. There were no speeches, just knowing glances and an air of belonging that can't be bought with checks or inherited with titles. At the end of dinner, one of the interns, a shy girl with curly hair and a soft voice, is approached. "How you did to avoid yelling at them? When did they humiliate you?" Ivy smiled with melancholy. "Because I no longer needed them to listen to me. I was already knew who was it." That answer was left floating in the air, more powerful than any revenge, because Ivy had learned that screaming isn't always a sign of strength. Sometimes elderly courage is in resisting without noise, in hold the dignity when everything around you is trying to tear it away from you. And that night, in amidst ordinary people and sincere gestures, Ivy found something that no one could have imagined. Inheritance could offer peace. To the tomorrow next, Ivy walked barefoot for the floor cold of the library, a habit he had adopted when I needed to think without distractions. His steps, they were soft, almost silent, as if they didn't want to interrupt the stillness of the books that surrounded him. He stopped in front of a glass case where Logan had kept his first editions, and among them placed a small object, the flower that the gardener you had given weeks ago, now dry but intact. It was a symbol, not of victory, but of permanence, fragile. Things also, they can resist, she thought, and she was proof, living of that. After the breakfast, Logan, he handed over a sealed letter. "When I'm not really here anymore," he said, with a tired smile. Ivy didn't open it. He kept it in the same box where they slept old letters and the memories without price. She was not a woman in a hurry, nor of exhibitions. "I knew that the time you would teach, when was the right time to read those words. In the meantime, she devoted herself to living, not as a rich widow, not as the unexpected heiress of an empire, but as a free woman, free to demonstrate, free to please, free to survive judgment alien, because in the end, that was what mattered most cattle, the freedom to be, without need for explanations." One afternoon, Ivy left the main compound alone and walked to the old gazebo that was hidden among the trees. There, where no one else used to go, he placed a wicker chair and sat down with a cup of tea warm between the hands. He was not wearing mobile, nor no papers, no agendas, just the sky, the distant song of the birds and their breathing rhythmic. It was a sacred space, not because someone it had blessed, but because there could, at last, hear his own silence, the same silence that so bothered the others, the one they confused with weakness. And that was now his most powerful shield. Since then, hidden corner, Ivy wrote his first diary, not to be published, not to be read others, but to remember, so as not to forget who had been before the world tried to disguise it. Page after page, he reconstructed the girl who dreamed in libraries, the woman who loved without asking for anything, the wife who accompanied in the shadows, the figure that stood in the middle of a room full of ridicule. He didn't need to embellish the history. It was enough with write it as it was, a succession of acts small with consequences immense. Because sometimes the quieter gestures are those who finish shaking empires' integers. Do you know someone who needs a reminder? Send this story to them. With he passed of the time, the mansion Thorn turned around a different place. not because of its walls or its relics, but because of the energy that she breathed. The employees, they no longer walked in tiptoes, neither they spoke in whispers for fear of hierarchies invisible. They greeted each other by name, they listened to each other. They knew they were seen. Ivy had transformed a symbol of power into a space of respect, and it there was made without high-sounding speeches, neither promises empty, only with presence, with coherence, with that calm that makes those who are uncomfortable, they build its value in the noise. One morning, while crossed in the lobby, Ivy stopped in front of the large portrait of Logan hanging above the chimney. He watched for a long time, not with nostalgia, but with gratitude. He had trusted in she more than anyone, even when the whole world doubted, and she there was returned that trust, not with words, but with facts. He approached the frame, passed fingers through the golden corner, and said in a low voice, "The we did well." It was a silent farewell, not of love, but of pain that once carried for not being seen, because now it was. Not by shouting, not by imposing, but by having resisted, again and again, without betray oneself, never. Years later, when Ivy was already, he had grey hair, and his walking was slower but just as steady, a young journalist, he looked for her again, this time not to talk of the scandal, but of legacy. What do you want them to remember you? Ivy closed the eyes for a moment before answering. That I didn't leave when everyone wanted me to. There was no pride in his voice, only certainty, because his history was not one of conventional triumph. It had no glorious endings or epic revelations. It was the story of a woman who refused to be erased, who chose stand still when everyone tried reduce it to a mistake. The interview never was published. Ivy, it asked, so I don't want to be remembered for what others they said about me, but for what I did when nobody looked, and so was. His name never made headlines, but it did transformed lives. In the foundation, in the mansion, in the paths that he opened without to boast. His influence, it was like her, subtle, firm, irreversible, because it was not necessary to raise your voice to change the world. It was enough by not letting it happen to you, they will snatch without fighting for it first. The day Ivy Clark died, there were no headlines or ceremonies multitudinous. It was a quiet dawn, with soft clouds and a warm breeze coming through the open windows of the mansion. In his room, resting as always it did, with serenity. About his bedside table, a dried flower, the violet of the gardener, and an unopened letter, Logan's. He never needed read it. I knew what I was saying, because some truths don't need right to feel. And in that final silence, Ivy left as she lived, without thunder, but leaving an echo that would endure beyond any testament. Days later, someone found an underlined sentence in one of his diaries. Respect is not demanded, it is sown. That line, simple and forceful, was discreetly engraved on a plate that was placed in the roundabout where I used to write. It was not a monument, not a statue, just a phrase, a wicker bench, and a palpable peace that enveloped the air. Who they met, his history, that they counted in a low voice, almost like a secret being protected, because Ivy Clark didn't need raise the voice for the world to hear. It was enough with his presence, and that presence, dignified, firm, unbeatable, would never again be ignored. If you got this far, prove it was worth it. The pain. Share this story with someone who values the dignity,